I think that my assignment is to try to give you my perspective on the history of the violence against women movement, my own experience with it, maybe some of my reflections about what we did well, what we maybe could have done better, as well as some thoughts about where we might be headed. And in doing that, I just want to say that I myself have a lot of questions still about terms like movement, my movement, whose movement, who are we talking about when we talk about movement, about the movement. And so I don't have the answers for that. And I'm going to try, as I'm talking to speak only from my own experience and only from my own perspective. And I don't see it as the perspective or the story to tell. So all of us have a very important role in doing that together and in figuring out ways to bring forth the stories that so many people that we know out there also have. So I put together all these slides, and here's what happened. Okay, I thought, wow, cohort 2, super, super smart people from doing amazing work, and what is it that I have to say to them? And so the first place I went was just completely into my head, because I thought, well, I should try to impress upon you what I know about movement history and movement politics. And so I did all these slides, and then this morning I woke up and I was just like, what is the matter with me? I should just talk to you about, my experience doing this work and just some of the most memorable events and the most memorable people and what I've taken from all of that. But I want to just tell you, I guess, the chronology of Nan, because that's what I know. In some ways, that's the only thing I know. And it's a chronology that has been informed and supported and taught and mentored and blessed by more people than I can count, by everyone in this room and by people, wonderful people, literally all over the country and all over the world. And the thing that is humbling for me about that is when I think about how much effort and resource has been put into me and invested in me so that I could be here with all of you today, and how much we believe that every woman and every girl deserves that same investment. That's a huge task for us. Huge. So I'm incredibly humbled, right, when I think about all of the people behind me that I bring here into this room, some of whom I'll name, but I just imagine each of you has a similar kind of story like that. So that's what I know. And what I don't know is what all that's going to lead to yet. That's what we're figuring out together. And but I don't know. It's a great adventure to me. And I feel like to be able to ask the question and to be able to admit that I don't have the answers is kind of new, because I have felt tremendous pressure in my work life to have the answers. But I don't have all of the answers. And in the true spirit of the move to end violence and the geese, I am just one goose. And so right now I happen to be the goose that's wired up with mics and has the camera pointing at me, but then, very shortly I'll step back to the side and then you are the lead geese. So that I am just one goose talking to you, right, honking at you right now. Okay, so that's me. So I want to go back to 1977, which was my introduction to anti-violence work. And I was a senior in high school, and I was taking a class called Family Living. And the two things that we did that were of use in that class were we learned how to balance a checkbook, and we had to do community service. And so for my community service project, I chose to go through the volunteer training for a local rape crisis organization called King County Rape Relief. And then when my 30 hours of community service were over, I had just finished the training, and I thought, well, why don't I just sign up for a couple of these crisis line shifts? And so I did. And the first call that I went out on was out into the kind of the far reaches of King County, which is where Seattle is located. And I met with a 13-year-old girl who had been raped by her neighbor. And she was a girl who lived with her single mother. They lived on welfare. The girl had profound learning disabilities and really had no understanding of what had happened to her. And I think in the time that I spent with her and with her mother, I learned several things, among them that bad things happen to good people, that you can't turn your back on what you know, and that when you say to someone, thank you for the courage that you have shared with me, that you then owe that person something for the rest of your life. So she's here with me, you know, and that was my very first kind of, I don't know what the right word is, but just launch into the work of doing anti-violence work. I never set out to do it. I was on the fast track to medical school. But, you know, it changed my life profoundly, and I haven't turned my back on her. So in the time that I was in college then, after that, I did quite a bit of campus organizing around sexual assault. And then when I graduated from college, my second job was as a graveyard counselor at a local domestic violence shelter. I don't want to say a lot about working at the shelter, but I want to talk about one of the things that was happening at that time. So that was in 1982. On July 15th of 1982, the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield was found floating in the Green River. And she was the first known victim of the Green River killer, Gary Ridgway. And in the rest of that summer of 1982, 6 more bodies were found. And in the subsequent years, 48 bodies were found that were attributed to the Green River killer. In 2001, so that was started in 1982. In 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested for those murders, and on November 5th of 2003, he pled guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree. Now, when he was in court making his pleas, I was driving on my way to a board meeting for the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and I was near the site of our meeting, and I just happened to have the radio on, and they were broadcasting the court proceedings live, and I just had to pull over and just listen, and it took an hour and a half for him to do that, because the judge would say, you know, in the murder of Wendy Lee Caulfield, how do you plead to the charge of, you know, aggravated murder in the first degree? And he would say guilty. And then they'd go on and on and on. 48 names of women. And I just sobbed, when I was listening. In 1984, there was a group pulled together that was called the Women's Coalition to Stop the Green River Murders. And I had the opportunity to participate in that group. And we basically were trying to get media attention and citizen attention to the fact that the Green River murders were mounting up, and there was not adequate police attention. So we were very much embattled with the Green River Task Force, which was a special unit of the King County Sheriff's Office, and very, I would say, almost militant about these murders. And so that's me in 1984 at a Take Back the Night march, and Chandra drew that picture. I had permed hair, and that was my uniform of the day. But the thing now, looking back, for me, is the person that we were the most embattled with was a deputy in the sheriff's department whose name was Dave Reichert. And he then went on to become the King County Sheriff. And he is now a representative of the 8th District in the U.S. Congress. And, so there I was 20 years ago protesting against Dave. And when I go now to meet with him as one of our congressmen, I have a really, I feel like I've come kind of to this other place with him. And the last time that I met with him, I said to him, I want to thank you for the work that you did on the Green River Task Force. I don't think very many people thank you for that, but I want to thank you for it because I know that you kept working on that after the task force disbanded. And I know that every time a body was found, you went and you met with the family of the victim. And you didn't have to do that. And you helped them have closure that they had been waiting years to have. And so I want to thank you for that. Now, he kind of was glorified, right, as being the guy who solved the Green River murders. And okay, but I also think that, for myself, I had to be able to come around and say, there was something that you did for those families, and by extension, for those young women that you didn't have to do, and there are people who appreciate that. The victims of the Green River killer were primarily African American, Latina, and Native American young prostituted women. And so in my experience during those few years of working on the Women's Coalition, my learning was so stark about which women and girls are expendable. And which women and girls people don't care about, and even if they know what happens to them, they still choose to do nothing. So that was, for me, a really early and profound lesson in, even though I was working in my day job in an organization that is now squarely positioned in what I call the mainstream center of the domestic violence and sexual assault movement, my learning has always been in the margins. Always been in the margins. It's been in what happens to women and girls in the margins. It's been what happens to communities, the ignorance, the dismissal, the pushing away. So even though, everything else that I'm going to say comes from, this kind of, I work in the mainstream, in quotes. The people that I do the most work with are in the mainstream. My learning is from the margins. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. I think now of the domestic violence and sexual assault movement as a new social movement. There's a whole field of study about new social movements and what social movements have in common. The kinds of goals that they have, and the kinds of experiences that they have, and the kind of the shared learning that social movements have. And so I think that we, in the violence against women movement, made some strategic decisions early on that have brought us down this path to where we are today in terms of the mainstream development. And the way that I think of this is kind of parallel to some of the slides about new social movements, which is that the strategies had goals. We also learned some lessons from them. So the very first one, and this was a natural one. I don't know how we could have done this differently, but we very early on claimed rape and battering as women's issues. It was an outgrowth of the feminist women's liberation movement. It was very much connected to reproductive choice and reproductive self-determination. I think that the anti-rape work began about 5 years before the domestic violence work began, and very much claimed by women as a women's issue. And then quickly we went to focusing on women's victimization. Now, I don't know that we said we choose now as a strategy to focus on women's victimization, but looking back, I think we focused on women's victimization. We did not focus on men's violence. And now we see that we are focusing more on men's violence, but at the time we really focused on women's victimization, and it was in the spirit of, this happened to me, what's happened to you, right? It was consciousness raising, it was self-disclosure, it was sisterhood, it was all of that, and we focused on women's victimization, and that gave rise very quickly to services, support groups, crisis lines, safe homes, shelters. So this trajectory of, it's a women's issue, we're going to look at women's victimization, we're going to create services, was intentional. I'm not sure it was strategic. It was reactive. It was loving. It was powerful. It was unresourced. It was revolutionary. So there was a lot of energy at the time, I think, and we felt like that was really the way for women to have power, was to do it together, was to share our common experiences of being female. We talked about rape and battering as conditions of being female. So the next, I think, huge strategic direction that we went in was criminalization. So we made rape and battering issues for the state, and we created statutory measures and remedies. And I think so much of where we are now is really the direct result of the decisions to criminalize. And at the time, those were incredibly strategic. And they helped to fund life-saving services, and they helped to create structures that could hold rapists and abusers accountable. But a huge decision. The other things that happened were we began to theorize. We wanted to answer the question, why does this happen? So we created causation theories. Learned behavior was one. Learned behavior was a huge one. And I think that, what we did was we took violence and we situated it in families. And we took it out of culture and we situated it in families. And so families then were responsible for the learning to be violent and the learning to be a victim. And that's how we talked about it. And so, to me, that was a critical point of beginning to lose some hope. And when I would go out and talk to high school groups about this, invariably, there would be a young man who would say, okay, so my dad beats my mom, and you're saying there's no hope for me. And, sometimes doing this work, it's like, just the heart breaks, So I think it took us a long time before we could figure out what was the answer to that young man's question, or figuring out how to talk about these things in a way that young men and young women don't have to ask those questions. Our services took on a more treatment and clinical orientation. I think this is particularly true in sexual assault work. I don't offer that as a critique. I just think it's true. And so, again, that's had many benefits, and it's had some downsides. And then we separated the work of domestic violence and sexual assault. And that has been, I think, both strategic and a mistake, in my humble opinion. So that, Chandra drew a little thing for me, which is basically, again, just a kind of a graphic representation of, we had women's issues. We went very quickly to focusing on victimization, and out of the focus on victimization came these other strategic efforts, right? Criminalization, learned behavior, separating sexual assault from domestic violence. So I think that's it. That's the history according to Nan. Now, a couple of things. So I just want to say a little bit about two other experiences that I've had. I worked for many years with the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I worked there at a time when there were not other, to speak of, national organizations. There was the National Coalition Against Sexual Assault, but there wasn't the plethora of organizations that we have today. And so NCADV was kind of the organization, and it was where the action was. And two very pivotal kinds of time periods. The first was 1986, when Edwin Meese was the Attorney General, and we, I think her name was Lois Haight Harrington, was the Assistant Attorney General. Do you remember her? And we really wanted to get Department of Justice money. We'd never had it before. And so we got a very small grant, but then we really got into internal struggle over the fact that this grant would not allow us to talk about same-sex violence. We couldn't use the word lesbian. We couldn't use the term same-sex. And the money was to pay for brochures. So there was a great internal struggle within NCADV over whether or not to take the DOJ money. And in the end, NCADV decided not to. And a small portion of folks from within NCADV left the organization and took the money and made the brochures. Okay, so that's one. 1988, Johnson & Johnson Corporation offered to fund a national domestic violence hotline, the first hotline. Johnson & Johnson had not divested from South Africa. And so, again, this raised deep internal struggle over whether or not to accept funding from a corporation that supported apartheid. And within NCADV, it pitted the formerly battered Women's Task Force against the Women of Color Task Force, where you have one group saying women are dying, you have another group saying people are dying. So untenable tension, right? And in the end, NCADV took the money, created a hotline, hired many, many women of color to staff that hotline because you need a diverse staff. And the next time around when the money came up for renewal, turned the money down. So all of those folks who were staffing the hotline had to be laid off. So very, very difficult internal politics of the organization being driven by the economic conditions. I think I tell you that just because I really believe that we have to be constantly in tune with how the external environment affects us individually, affects our organizations, affects how we think and speak and, do our work. I was a founding member of Insight, and it was so funny when I got selected to be in the MEV cohort. Some of my Insight buddies said, "Oh, so is that like Insight with money?" And I said, could it be? I mean, what would Insight with money have been? I don't know. But the cool thing about Insight, did anyone here go to the Color of Violence conference? So in 2000, the Color of Violence, right, the original vision for that was a very small group of activists to come together to talk about the impact, right, in the intersection of racial justice and anti-violence against women work. So we thought it'd be a very small group of people, just a think tank. 2,000 people came, 2,000 people had to be turned away. So the hunger for that kind of dialogue and that kind of connection was, we had not imagined it, and so then we had to do another one. And then there was another one in 2005 in New Orleans. And the funny thing about Insight, I think, I was just on the website, because I've been trying to figure out what is Insight doing now, and I'm not really sure. I think there are some local chapters going. I think there's still a national kind of mothership that's functioning. But people identify with Insight still. Even if I say, "Oh, are you in Insight?" And people will say, "Yeah." And are you? And I was like, "Well, yeah, kind of, I was." And I'm like, "What is Insight doing now?" "I don't know." "Do you know?" "No." But the identity around it is so strong. And so I think that it just, speaks to the need people have to organize and to be with like-minded, good-hearted people. Okay. So in my work world, I see a lot of this hamster wheel fatigue where people are doing the same thing. And this is because we have a nonprofit industrial complex of shelters and rape crisis centers where, with a lot of specialization, a lot of standardization, all the things that characterize an industry, right? I mean, in the most Marxian sense. So hamster wheel fatigue among the workforce. I think we have a better understanding of intersectionality, much better recognition of intergenerational trauma and the impact of that on communities. There's margin to center energy. There's new leadership. There's a focus on violence prevention with youth and girls and boys, social media, social activism, and social change, and a resurgence of political will and hope. And I am not like a positive person. I'm not. So when I say to you that I see among my colleagues my colleagues all around Washington State, my colleagues at the national level, a resurgence of political will and hope, that's a little something. I think we really saw it with the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. I think we saw it in the fact that people were willing to go 500 days without that reauthorization, that they were willing to say, we will not have a Violence Against Women Act because we will not compromise away these things that we care about. We are going to do this until we have protections for Native American women, better protections for immigrant survivors, and better attention to LGBTQ communities in the Violence Against Women Act. And we have not done that before. Those of us who do the policy advocacy on VAWA, we have compromised and compromised and compromised historically to get that thing through, and we did not do that this time. And I think that was a tremendous show of political will. And people are sick and tired of compromising. And that is an opening for movement building. I really believe that. People are saying, we have worked for 35, 40 years. We've done the very best we can. We've created an incredible array of services, allies, work in communities, and we have failed to end violence. So what more? What else can we do? So I think we have a huge opportunity. Okay, my last slide. Nope, okay, yeah, there. We cannot ignore the importance of science. Okay, so just very quickly, 2 to the x minus 1, where x is the number of people, that is the number of relationships that exist among those people. So you can think about that in terms of the cohort. Yeah? I mean, I just did this with a group. They had 15 people on their staff. There were 32,400 relationships happening at any given time in that group. So I don't need to walk you through this, but it's true. It's math. You can't argue with it. You can't argue with it. So if you have 19 people in the cohort, 2 to the 19th minus 19 minus 1, that's how many relationships are happening in the cohort. So when we're talking about movement building with like thousands more, the relationships are going to be incredibly complicated. And there's going to be a gazillion of them. It's like that thing where if you take a piece of paper and you fold it 32 times, it'll go from the earth to the moon. I mean, you fold it in half 32 times or whatever it is they say. It's not very many. It'll go from the earth to the moon. Okay, then this is true too. That this is true too, that the relationships between objects define the object. Okay? So if we have objects within a movement, the relationships between those objects are going to define the object. And that has happened to us, right? Our movement gets defined very often by how we relate to one another. Okay? Survival of the fittest, natural selection is true. And so for us, in our movement building, to make sure, like who is the fittest? Who deserves to survive? How is that going to happen? This is an uphill struggle, friends, right? To defy Darwinism is an uphill struggle for us. We say we're committed to it, and all I'm doing is trying to point out that the science of it is working against us. So we have to be deep in our commitment. To every action, there is a reaction. We know this to be true, and nature abhors a vacuum. So if we don't do this, someone else will. Nature abhors a vacuum. So we have to do it.